Good morning, Ms. Richards.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning to everyone who is watching. Let me introduce the panel that we have for today, and let me explain where everyone is. I suppose I should start with myself. For once, I'm not in the hearing room, taking the advice not to be in the hearing room, not be at work, away from home, where I can be. This is one of those sessions, those rare sessions, where I've taken the judgment that I can be, so I am at home. I think all our medical experts, a very impressive panel, are also at home. Although if I may start with Professor Kerridge, you are at home in Sydney, are you?
Yes, that's right.
Where it is an unbelievable 35 degrees, did you say, at 9 o'clock at night?
I think it's plummeting to 34.
Well, that's a distant memory in this shore at the moment. Yeah. Welcome. Then we have Dr. Melanie Kazarian, and you're at home in near Southampton?
Yes, that's right.
And Professor Julian Savulescu, are you at home near Oxford?
I'm in Oxford, yes I am, yes, Eddington.
We have Professor Cave. You're in the north of England, are you?
Right, yes, hello, I'm in North Yorkshire.
And finally, we have Professor Parsides. And where are you, Professor?
I'm here, Sir Brian. I'm in Brighton.
In Brighton. So we have far-flung members of the panel.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I can hear you. You're frozen on the screen for the moment, on my picture.
Hello?
Hello? We may need to make sure that we've got the connection. Yes, I can see you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, everyone else can hear me, I hope.
Yes.
Could you? That's fine. What you're looking at is me at home. Then Miss Richards, if you'd say something, Miss Richards, please.
Yes, I'm here with the normal, very small number of people in the inquiry hearing room.
So that'll be 3 members of council team, 1 person whose job it is to make sure that you have the right documentation shown on screen where it's necessary. Mary, my clerk, who will take the oath for each of you in turn in a moment or two, and a couple of members of the inquiry support team. You are talking not to them, however, really, but to 100 or so people who are watching online. They too will be in their homes or other locations where they can conveniently watch, and I welcome them too. So the scene is set. Mary, would you administer the oath, please? Mary?
She's on her way, sir.
Thank you.
So, I think we've lost Professor Parsides, however.
Okay. Who'd like to start? Just raise a hand. Fine. Please state your full name.
My name's Professor Emma Cave.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. On to the next. Raise a hand, someone. Okay. Please state your full name.
Professor Ian Kerridge.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
On to the next. Volunteer, please. Yes, okay, fine. Right there. Please state your full name
Dr. Melanie Kazarian.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Fine. Please state your full name
Julian Savalescu.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Now I see we're having a little bit of problem with the connection with
Professor Farsidis, yes.
Can you hear me, Professor Farsidis? So Brian,
Well,
what would you like to do?
What we shall do is we shall proceed as we had intended, without Professor Farsidis for the moment, but ask our IT experts to make sure that they get a connection as soon as possible.
Fine.
But when that happens, then she can be.
Professor Farsidis, can you hear me?
I think we'll wait to make sure we've got a connection, Ms. Richards.
It looks as though the connection's frozen again, I'm afraid. Whilst we're waiting for that to be resolved, I was proposing to start by asking each of the members of the panel to introduce themselves and say a little about their expertise.
Well, let's start, shall we?
So can we start? I'm going to do it in the order in which I can see people on the screen. So could I start with you, Dr. Kazarian, if you could just indicate who you are and for the benefit of those watching and your particular areas of expertise.
Of course, so I'm a lecturer in law. I teach at Southampton University, and my expertise is in medical errors, in particular criminal actions and criminal responsibility for medical errors. And I have expertise also in comparing different jurisdictions in relation to criminal responsibility for medical errors. In particular, the French and English jurisdiction.
Thank you. Professor Cave.
Hello, yeah, my name's Professor Cave, and I work at Durham.
Every time it comes back, it just freezes.
Sorry, Dr. Farsidis Professor Farsidis was interrupting, I'm afraid. We'll hope that she interrupts without any problems of ice on the screen. But for the moment, I'm sorry, Professor Cave. Just go on.
No, that's quite all right. So I'm a professor of law, of healthcare law, at Durham University, and I'm also a member of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. And my particular expertise tends to focus on issues around informed consent. Thank you.
Professor Savulescu.
Hello, my name's Julian Savulescu. I'm originally a medical doctor, but I haven't practiced for over 20 years. I've been Professor of Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford since 2002. I specialise generally in medical ethics. I wrote a textbook with colleagues on medical ethics in law in the UK based on the core curriculum. And I also edited the Journal of Medical Ethics for over 10 years. I run a research program with over 30 people, and I primarily focus these days on ethics of genomics, neurotechnologies, but I've worked in all areas of medical ethics over the last 30 years.
Thank you. Professor Kerridge.
Yes, I'm a Professor of Bioethics and Medicine at the University of Sydney here in Australia, and I'm also Chair of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians Ethics Committee, and until recently I was Director of an Ethics Centre also here at the University of Sydney. I'm also a haematologist and bone marrow transplant physician, and I work full-time at Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney. My areas of interest cut across medical ethics, clinical ethics, and research and public health ethics, so it's all related to this inquiry.
Thank you. Professor Farsides, I think we've got you back. Are you able to hear me?
I am. I'm terribly sorry. I've had terrible connection problems for some reason.
Not at all. I'm going to suggest that the other members of the group have been sworn in. I'm just going to suggest that Mary will ask you to take the affirmation.
Thank you.
Please state your full name.
Bobby Farsides.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And Professor Farsides, can I invite you, as the others have done, just to tell us a little about your expertise?
Certainly. I'm a Professor of Clinical and Biomedical Ethics at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. My background is as a political theorist and moral philosopher. And for the last 20 years, my research has focused on the ethical challenges faced by healthcare professionals and medical scientists working in what I would define as ethically.
I think we seem to have lost Professor Farsides again, unfortunately. Sir, do you want us to continue as best we can?
Yes, I think that's what we have to do.
Professor
Sorry,
Farsides.
can you still hear me?
We lost you for a moment, but you're back. You were telling us about your background.
Okay. Yes. Did you hear any of what I said?
I think we heard most of it, but then it stopped at some point.
Okay. Well, I work in empirical bioethics and theoretical bioethics, and my particular interest is in the challenges faced by healthcare professionals and medical scientists when they work in ethically challenging fields. I'm also involved as an ethicist in areas of public policy, and I serve as a member of the BMA Ethics Committee.
Thank you. And the group produced a report on medical ethics in April 2020, answering a number of questions set out in 2 letters of instruction. Before we turn to the issues covered by the report, I'm just going to explain the areas that your evidence today and tomorrow won't cover for the benefit largely of those listening. I will be asking you to explain aspects of your report, and we'll be asking you a number of questions relating to issues arising out of the report, many of which have been suggested by core participants to the inquiry. I won't be asking you as I think you know, about individual patient cases or individual clinical conduct, because you've not been in a position to see or read much of that evidence. I will be seeking to explore with you the relevant ethical principles which will be for Sir Brian to apply in due course to the facts as he finds them. Now, some core participants have proposed questions about ethical principles relating to decision-making by government, civil servants and chief medical officers. My understanding is that you don't as a group feel able to address those issues in your evidence this week. They go beyond the scope of the letters of instruction that were sent to you, but that it may be that those are matters upon which you can assist the inquiry at a future stage, possibly in conjunction with the Public Health and Administration Expert Group. The last point I wanted to just clarify before we start is, although you've referred to a number of pieces of historic guidance, and we'll look at a small number of those pieces of guidance in the course of your evidence, your report has made clear that you're not medical historians, and you haven't attempted to catalogue or cite all the numerous guidelines that might be of relevance. For the benefit of core participants and others who are listening, the inquiry has gathered that material, will be producing a chronology of relevant guidance and related materials, and in order to place that into the public domain, will be providing a presentation on those matters at a later hearing, probably after Easter. Now, with that rather lengthy introduction, I wanted to turn to ask you to deal with some general principles, and then going to ask you about issues relating to consent and treatment. And those are the areas I propose to cover mostly today. Tomorrow, I'll be turning to issues of testing and research. And I should say that Professor Kerridge, I think you're with us for the mornings only because of the time difference. And so we'll come to testing, which I think is an area where you've made particular contributions to the report tomorrow morning. Can I start by asking a broad question? I was going to pitch it to Professor Farsidis, but as we've lost her again, I'm going to ask, first of all, Professor Savulescu and then perhaps Professor Kerridge to comment on this. When we talk about medical ethics, what do we mean? What is it, and what is bioethics, please?
It's a very good question, and I think at the core of many of the problems that we face today. So medical ethics is, first of all, about being able to identify value judgments rather than factual judgments. And secondly, being able to reason through and justify a value judgment decision. So medicine is concerned primarily or often with facts about whether treatments will work or won't work, what the diagnosis is. But value judgments about what we should do. And in many cases, values are hidden and often one set of values dominates. We can see this, and I can talk more about this in the way in which the pandemic has played out. But medical ethics is primarily the ability to identify value judgments or issues of value and right and wrong and good and bad, and what we should do, as distinct from factual judgments, that is the way things are, could be, would be, probably will be, and so on, and being able to think through using ordinary systems of reason, but also ethical theories, concepts and principles, like the idea of autonomy or best interests, to make better value judgments.
And is there a difference between medical ethics and bioethics, or are they the same thing?
Medical ethics is a subspecialty of bioethics. Bioethics is generally to do with issues around life. Medical ethics is specifically around medical practice.
Now, some of the writing to which your report refers talks about a distinction between ethics and etiquette. And I was going to ask Professor Cave perhaps to address this, because I picked it up from Medicine, Patients and the Law, co-authored, Professor, by you and Professor Margaret Brazier, where there's a section which talks about ethics as opposed to etiquette and looks at guidance from the past in terms of etiquette. Are you able to explain what's meant by that?
there. So in terms of etiquette, these might be professional guidelines or areas where doctors have come together to decide that things should be done in a certain way. Whereas ethics is much broader. It's about the moral theory and which of course also feeds into professional guidance as to what ought to be done in a certain situation. So etiquette is just a little bit more practical about what we might do in a given situation.
Professor Kerridge, is there anything you'd like to contribute in response to the very general question I asked?
Perhaps going to the last one first, the distinction between ethics and etiquette. I think it's an important question because the history of ethics in many ways is the history of etiquette up until the last couple of hundred years. Much of the early history of what we now know as ethics was concerned with how different groups would treat each other. Apothecaries and physicians, or surgeons and barber surgeons and the like, and the rules of engagement, who counted, who had authority, who had status, who was able to claim fees and the like, and that concerns etiquette much more than ethics. Ethics is much broader than that. It is, as Julian's described, it's conceptions of how we should behave, not just to other professional groups, but our obligations and duties to others that are independent, possibly of the profession or the group to which they belong.
Professor Farsides, I don't know whether we've lost you again. Yes, I think we have, unfortunately. It may be that we'll be able to resolve Professor Farsides' connection issues at the breaks. What's the objective of having rules of medical ethics, and whose interests or are they designed to protect? Professor Kerridge.
That's a great question. I think the answer to that has changed substantially. We've been careful to say that we're not historians, and that's certainly true, but by the same token, if you look at more ancient codes of ethics, and to be honest, even codes of ethics up to the 1950s, early 1960s, they were arguably very much about serving the interests of the group that had drawn them up. They were concerned with the interests of the profession, enshrining their status, making a declaration to the community, if you want, as to what they would and would not do. So I think arguably they were serving professional interests and maintaining control and autonomy of that professional group. For the last 40, 50 years, that's changed. And it's now seen that there is a very clear ethical obligation to meet the interests of patients and research subjects and the community. And that's significantly changed the way that ethical codes have been constructed, that ethical rules have been constructed, that laws have been constructed in the health field and public health field, and to a lesser extent in research. And it's framed even how the codes are drawn up and who draws them up. So they're not necessarily drawn up just now by doctors, but there'll be consumer representatives, there'll be disease advocates, there'll be non-physician health practitioners, lawyers, and so forth, all involved in drawing up codes of practice. So I think they're much more substantive, much more rigorous, and they've changed their very shape.
Professor Farsides, I've been exploring with the panel what we mean by medical ethics and what the purpose of medical ethics is. I know you'll have missed some of the exchanges. How would you answer those questions? What's medical ethics and what it's about?
Thank you. Well, I do apologise if I repeat anything, but medical ethics is now, I think, an embedded aspect of medicine. It is the recognition that, as well as applying scientific knowledge, understanding human psychology, having a sense of the society in which you practice medicine, you should also be well aware of the ethical expectations upon you when you take on this very particular role. And I'm sure my colleagues have said that over time, more and more medical ethics guidance has appeared. Principles of medical ethics have informed our decisions in all sorts of areas of public policy related to medicine and science. And medical schools now see it at the request of the GMC as a continual strand in medical education that a young doctor should emerge being able to recognise the ethical challenges of their work as well as any other.
And so this may be a somewhat simplistic way to put it, but a purpose of medical ethics is to assist healthcare professionals to know how they ought to act in the discharge of their professional responsibilities. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that is fair. We use that word a lot, and maybe contrast, for example, with a social scientist who's interested in studying what does happen. Moral philosophers are keen to explore what ought to happen, and then as one becomes a sort of applied philosopher, you want to assist people in ensuring that they are able to do what they ought to do, because if we just set very lofty, unachievable standards, that doesn't help anybody.
Professor Savulescu.
So I just wanted to add something to what Ian said when you asked him about why we need ethical rules. And I agree with everything that he said and what Bobby said. But there's another reason. We need rules so people can know what their expectations are and align themselves. So to give you an analogy, what should the speed limit be? So the speed limit in this country is 70 miles an hour. It's unlimited. In Germany, it's 60 miles an hour in Australia, and so on. Now, the right speed limit depends on how you weigh the values of safety. The lower the speed limit, the safer it is, versus economic efficiency, pleasure, convenience, carbon emissions. So you need to set a speed limit, but it will depend on how you weigh different values, and there can be reasonable differences about that. There isn't clearly a correct speed limit, but we need to know what the speed limit is if we're to drive our cars. And to take another example, vaccination policy in the pandemic. The UK has opted to vaccinate the oldest groups first. That will save the greatest number of lives, supposedly. However, the Netherlands has opted to vaccinate through lottery people over the age of 65. That will save fewer lives, but give more people a chance of having the vaccine. China is vaccinating the working age population. So those all indicate different values based on an understanding of the same facts. So in many cases, we can differ in what we think the right thing is to do, but we need to have reasons for it. And the reason for the rules are to make it clear what we've decided. But the fact that we have a set of rules doesn't make those the right rules or necessarily the best set of rules.
And are there particular kinds of situations in which ethical principles may be of particular significance?
Well, essentially, every day we face conflicts of different values, and where those decisions have life and death consequences or serious morbidity associated with them, we need to be clear what the different values are at play and apply ethical principles to have a reasoned way of proceeding. So to take an example, in cancer care, some people will value living as long as possible as the most important thing. Others will want to maximise their independence and quality of life. So that influences whether you think the best treatment is chemotherapy or radiotherapy, for example. And unless you make those differences clear, you can't choose what is the best for that particular individual. So in the past, people thought, well, we know what the right answer is. We want to keep people alive as long as possible. So you'll have, surgery plus radiotherapy. But in fact, they involve different values around which people can have reasonably different conceptions about how to prioritise those values. So how you balance fairness or liberty against health, for example, in pandemic, is not something that there is a recipe for. And indeed, when the BMA or the General Medical Council picks a certain prioritisation, it will have reasons. But often those can be challenged with a different set of values and reasons. It's not to say that ethics is relative, it's just in the eye of the beholder. it's that there are many different values and principles that need to be weighed, and ethics is about identifying those and proceeding in a reasoned and rational way to balance those.
Just to add to what Julian said, if I could, I think it's also the case that not only are there lots of values at play, but it's commonly the case that all of these values are at play all of the time. Now, that's not to say that that they're weighed equally or they're equally salient, but there's few times in medicine where there aren't issues of risk or benefit or avoidance of harm or respect or some degree of concern for equity or access. These kinds of ethical principles are there all of the time, just that in different situations they may be more or less salient. And in addition to that, as Julian's described, in different situations they'll also be weighed or valued or balanced differently by different stakeholders.
I'm going to ask you in a moment to help us identify what the most fundamental principles or values are. But before we do that, Professor Cave, Dr. Kazarian, is there anything either of you would like to add to the general discussion that we've been having so far?
Just with respect to how the law interacts with ethics, they're not always clearly compatible, insofar as sometimes the law is behind and struggling to catch up, and we've seen that fairly recently with regards to informed consent. Insofar there was an agreement that the law wasn't perhaps protecting the autonomy interests of patients as much as it could have done, and then in 2015 the law caught up with guidance from the GMC and made that change. And sometimes it's the other way round. Sometimes professional guidance changes in order to keep up with the law. And indeed, we've seen that with consent as well, because in 2020, the GMC produced some new guidance, which gave more of an emphasis on the importance of dialogue, for example. So there is this rather sort of complex relationship between law and ethics, and they're not always exactly on the same page.
And so it's possible for something to be lawful but unethical?
Yes.
Yes, and in those situations, there's a strong ethical obligation on the clinician to act outside the law or to challenge the law. To give a brief, albeit Australian example, until a bit over 10 years ago, in some parts of Australia, doing cardiopulmonary resuscitation when somebody had a cardiorespiratory arrest was mandated. So this was not something that the law said or the Solicitor General said could be not done by a treating clinician. But reassuringly, people saw that when somebody was terminally ill, when doing CPR was futile, when a patient desperately didn't want it to be done but just would like to have a peaceful and respectful death, so people made the choice to ignore the law, and that was the appropriate thing to do at the time. The law's now changed, so again it's caught up to ethics in the way that Emma's described, but there are times when the ethically right thing to do is to act, if you want, against the law, and not just to do it outside of the law, but to take steps to try and promote law reform.
But that will also apply to professional guidelines. Sometimes professional guidelines can be unethical, and the ethical thing to do is not to follow them. To be, a moral and responsible doctor is to be able to give your own moral reasons for your actions and to be able to justify them.
And that's not something that obviously we're advocating should be done lightly. I mean, if somebody wants to do that, they have to be very, very careful to think through the situation, to think through the ramifications of doing that, to think through what may be the results for them and their colleagues, for the patients that they're working with, and so forth. So it needs to be very carefully considered, very carefully explained, and very carefully followed through.
And these examples show us that in equipping doctors to act ethically, we cannot simply rely on drawing their attention to law or guidance. We have to support them in developing skills that allow them to critically look at those pieces of paper, and also think from their own very full expertise of working with patients and their families, where change may be necessary or challenge may be necessary. So we've gone, I think, at an educational level from thinking very much of what people need to know about to thinking about how do we give people the skills to understand what is morally relevant in their day-to-day practice, and then when more challenging and difficult issues arise.
And I'll want to come back later to the issue of education and training for doctors. Just picking up on Professor Cave's point, Professor Cave, Dr. Kazarian, do you have a sense of whether the law within the United Kingdom, so whether that's the law covering the four component parts of the United Kingdom or more generally, has been slower to react to ethical developments than other jurisdictions such as Australia or Canada or the US?
Yes, I think there's a clear sense in which it has been slower, particularly with regards to protecting autonomy interest, with regards to informed consent.
And do you have any sense of why that is the case?
That's a difficult one to answer. We can see that there was a period of time where paternalism became very prevalent, and that followed the case of Bolan in law. But prior to that, there was actually less of an emphasis on paternalism. So there was a sort of blip, I think, in the law in relation to the protection of autonomy. It hasn't just been linear and developed consistently. This is something that Professor Brazier has shown recently in work looking historically back at the development of patient autonomy. But yes, there was this element of paternalism which stuck, and professional guidance attempted to remedy that. I suppose one of the reasons for it was a medical decision, a legal decision that was very high up. So the case of Sidaway was in the House of Lords, and it took time for another case to get to that level before it could be overruled. And there were several attempts in the lower courts to make subtle changes to try and get us towards that point, but it took some time for it to get to the Supreme Court in the Montgomery case for it to be fully challenged.
And Dr. Kazarian, do you have any thoughts on the rate at which the law in the United Kingdom responds to ethical developments as opposed to other jurisdictions?
I agree with what Professor Cave said, because I think there is a difference between how quickly ethics react to changes in society, like what has been said, and this is why ethics are really important, because different principles and different values take precedence over others depending on changes in society and depending on the situation at hand. Whereas with the law, the changes are a bit more difficult to embed or to react to, because there are different factors which come to play, and this is what we see with the Montgomery decision, like Professor Cave said, which it has been argued that recognizes the duty to inform patients in the law, but it was something that was already present in medical ethics for a longer time. So it's been a slow development in the law, and this has to do with different reasons. In particular, sometimes the law just wants to leave things to ethics, to principles in medical ethics, rather than being legal responsibility, legal principles. And this is why we see that some things are within the ethics remit rather than the legal remit. But now things have changed, and in particular because patients have more voice in how these changes affect them. These legal developments have sort of followed that trend, but there are still gaps in the law in relation to ethical values which protect patients.
I think
if I could just add, sorry, just add very briefly, just more generally, so looking beyond informed consent, there has been a process of juridification where the law has had more to do with issues of medicine. So the first edition of Medicine, Patients and the Law was about half the size of the book that we write now. The law is making its presence felt in many more areas than was the case, for example, in the 1970s and 80s.
Professor Kerridge, Professor Savulescu?
I think Ian might know this better than I do, but my memory is that the Montgomery decision essentially mimics the decision 20 years before in Rogers and Whittaker in Australia. And I think it is fair to say that the UK has been quite slow to evolve in many areas. In my view, the recent case of Charlie Gard is a sort of another example of that. I'm not blowing Australia's trumpet, but I think it is the case that things are slow to change in the UK.
Professor Kerridge?
Yeah, well, just to reiterate Julian's point, is that yes, the Montgomery case, similar issues had been considered here in Australia about 20 years ago. But there are some areas of health law in Australia, particularly in relation to reproduction and fertility, where this country has taken guidance from the UK and from developments in science in the UK. So I don't think it's necessarily an overall judgment that can be made, but I'll be guided by Emma and others on that one. I did want to make one point, though, about what we've all been talking about here, because I think it brings out the differences and the different strengths and weaknesses, if you want, of ethics and the law. I mean, ethics is brilliant at doing what Julian described before, is at thinking logically through new issues and the type of emerging challenges that Bobby works in. It can cope with complexity and nuance. It can be dynamic, and it can be done by individuals quickly in response to challenging situations. The law obviously has the advantage that it has clear link to sanction. It has support from a whole structured system, and it's less woolly and perhaps more tied to reason, if you want, than some types of ethics. And then codes are in between those two things. Codes may still take, years of time to be developed, by which stage they may already be open to different challenge because of developments in science on the one hand and changes in community values on the other hand. So I think there is a continuous sort of interplay between ethics and law and codes of ethics or codes of practice.
I wanted to ask you next to assist us with understanding in what are the fundamental moral principles or values which may be stable and consistent and which are of particular relevance to medical clinical decision making. I'm going to start, I think, with Professor Farsides in relation to that.
Thank you. Well, I think we start with the rather obvious statement that an individual's health is one of their greatest assets, and without life, you can not really continue to lock into other things of value. So we know how important somebody's health is to them. We also know that issues around your health can be sensitive. They can be issues that you might wish to remain private. They're things that have a very personal impact upon you as an individual and those who are close to you. So, of course, we're going to put at the centre of thinking about ethics how we acknowledge and respect the importance of somebody's health and how we manage any interactions with the person in the interests of their health, because we can also understand that in order to do good, we might sometimes have to engage in risk. We might have to do things which in the short term cause pain or discomfort or restrict somebody's activities. And I think we sum up in our own culture, and I think it's important to say that different cultures may have a different starting point, the profound importance of respecting people as individuals and respecting their autonomy. And there are many definitions of autonomy, but I think that the way I find it helpful to think about it is it's something that goes beyond your individual liberty, because it locks into you as an individual, your values, your beliefs, what matters to you, your plans, your projects. And if you stop and think about that for a moment, you can see that your autonomy could be either enhanced or threatened by the way in which you're treated in a medical setting. If you are listened to, if your values are understood by those who are working to assist you, then we have a good starting point. If not, then how is your autonomy going to be respected? And then we have to say, well, of course, we are all autonomous individuals attempting to live in society together, and there have to be compromises at times, and there has to be a commitment to respecting one another's autonomy and putting systems in place that allow us to benefit as many people as possible and to treat people fairly, to use principles of justice, to not treat people unequally for what we would want to think were morally irrelevant reasons. So we start to think not just of an individual patient being treated by an individual doctor, we think of that patient and that doctor as part of a social system. And increasingly over time, we've begun to talk about the social responsibilities in medicine that require us to think about how we treat an individual patient, always keeping that at the forefront of our mind, but understanding that some of the choices and actions that might have to be taken will be influenced by the impact of what we do for that patient on other patients. So I think we start with the primacy of a doctor's duty to an individual patient, but we don't forget that that individual patient is a member of a society of other people whose autonomy matters as well.
Professor Savulescu.
So I roughly agree with Bobby. Maybe just to put it in my sort of simple-minded fashion. So in one line, medical ethics is about doing what's in the best interests of the patient. Now, in a slightly more detailed way, it has three major steps. First of all, we have a set of resources for health, a big pool of resources. And on the basis of research and evidence, it's decided according to principles of justice which treatments will be made available for which conditions. So there's a big pool here, a big ethical decision about what to fund according to principles of justice. So, for example, take the example of cancer. It will be decided on the basis of evidence that surgery, radiotherapy and chemotherapy are appropriate options for breast cancer. So the next step is the doctor comes along and they have those treatments available to them and they make a diagnosis in the patient of breast cancer. And their job is then to decide which combination of these treatments, which are available to me, there might be others like proton therapy that are not available, which are available to me, do I think is best for this patient? And that today requires not just a medical decision, but a dialogue with the patient about their values and understanding the patient's autonomy to come to a recommendation about, for example, I think for you, surgery plus radiotherapy plus chemotherapy is the best option for you. So that's the best interest judgment. And best interest is about what's overall best for the patient in terms of well-being. The third stage is the patient again gets to exercise their autonomy, not only by expressing their values, but by accepting or rejecting that treatment, or by questioning whether or why another option is not best for them and whether that's acceptable from the range that's available, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, surgery. And finally, a decision is made about the specific course of action. So it's justice first, a best interest determination involving autonomy, and then autonomy in the end. The patient can reject any course of action. And it's important, I think, in terms of this inquiry, is even if there is no choice available to the patient. So I'm writing a paper on embryo selection at the moment and artificial intelligence. Now, patients can't make a decision meaningfully about which embryo to implant. But it's important that they understand how the decision was made, because ultimately it's their child and they have the right to understand important things that are happening to them, even if they can't change that in any meaningful way. And that's another important part of the doctor-patient relationship and medical ethics, to involve the patient in important stages that affect their lives, because ultimately it's the patient that has to lead their life. And the doctor is essentially a public servant, a servant to that end, using their knowledge of diagnosis and treatment and medicine to enable that.
Your report refers to a 1979 publication, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, by, is it Beecham, the pronunciation, or
yeah,
Beecham and Childress, identifying
yes.
4 principles: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. I've got that right. Can you just help us understand, first of all, what the significance, if any, of that publication and that work was in medical ethics terms?
Well, it's been a hugely influential work, and I think still, if you attend a medical conference and someone wants to make a swift reference to ethics, you often see Beecham and Childress's 4 principles put up on a PowerPoint slide. But it's also been subject to a lot of critique. And if you look at the difference between the later editions of the work and the earlier editions of the work, you will see the response to that critique, because the worry emerged that whilst very important, these 4 principles were embedded in a very Anglo-American socio-cultural context and might not necessarily apply as easily to other areas. But the basic idea is that if you have in mind these 4 principles of not doing harm to someone, the imperative to do good, you think, as Julian said, in a sort of system that is governed by just principles, and you respect the autonomy of your patient, you can more or less work your way through any scenario. So you can understand why that would be appealing, but you can also understand why some philosophers have thought of it as rather reductionist, or have questioned the extent to which in such a varied global society, but also in multicultural societies that we all inhabit, you can be so clear that these are the 4 overriding principles.
Professor Kerridge, is there anything you wanted to contribute?
I feel like I want to defend ethical principles, and possibly that's the answer. Is that if you look at how that text emerged, it emerged at a point where philosophy broadly, or ethics in particular, was struggling for perceptions of relevance, and there has been, arguably discussion about, what is the optimal theory or normative theory for approaching ethics for 2,000 years, without any sort of clear agreement of a single appropriate theory for thinking about determining what should be done in any one situation. And so what these authors did is they did go back to cases and to medicine in particular, and to try and tease out what core ethical principles there were. I think it's certainly fair to say that it does emerge from an Anglo-American context, but much of the criticism, in my view, looked at a very simplified version of a principle-based approach to ethics rather than what's been pejoratively called principlism. Because actually, as Bobby says, and what the authors go on to do in later editions, that they emphasise the way that they're used. And the key bits here are specification, balancing, and a broad approach to understanding how they fit into common morality, which includes virtues and culture and context and imagination and consideration of the other, if you want. So a whole range of other things. So I think recently there's been perhaps a softening of critique as ethical principles, rather than a single approach to using principles, is being looked at again. It's probably also worthwhile saying there are other formulations, some that list only two principles, beneficence and autonomy, as I think Julian was alluding to, and others that don't talk about ethical principles, but they talk about values. So talk about human flourishing and security, respect, and in some cases justice or equity as a basis for determining how we should behave, and that's a formulation that can work outside of medicine. So I think it's had a massive impact, and I think continues arguably to have a massive impact, particularly in areas outside of academia, but in science and medicine.
Can I say one thing in favour of them? I mean, I'm probably now the biggest fan of the four principles. I started off very sceptical. But having worked in this field for 30 years, I always start by just thinking, what do these principles say? So, they are respect for autonomy, which is the idea that each of us has our own life to live. We should be free and realise our own goals. Beneficence, which is you should promote people's well-being, which is a basic idea. Non-maleficence is you shouldn't harm people, and justice is you should distribute resources justly or fairly. And these are not Anglo-American; these are universal. I know Tom Beecham well. He's argued that these are universal principles, and these principles grew out of what was called the Belmont Report, that Tom Beecham and Jim Childress were authors of, which was an incredibly influential report that looked at research scandals and set out the guidelines for research ethics in the United States. And initially there were three: respect for autonomy, beneficence and justice, and Beecham added non-maleficence later. But these are things that matter. They matter to everyone. Everyone's life matters to them. And they want to be able to, whether they're in China or whether they're in the United States. So I think they are a good place to start. They're not the solution, but they're a very good first place to start about any ethical problem.
Professor Could I just add that, sorry, very briefly, that they weren't designed necessarily to give an answer as such. It's not the idea that two people could independently apply the four principles and they'll both come to the same answer necessarily. Rather, it's a way of bridging disagreement and of looking at the core ethical aspects of a particular problem and being able to come together to discuss them on the basis of these principles.
But we also have to share definitions, and I think one of the interesting ongoing debates around the four principles is, for example, how to define and the importance of autonomy. And if you look at something like feminist bioethics, which would always seek to emphasize the importance of relationships over sort of individual experience, that has challenged us to think in different ways. So I would absolutely accept the profound influence, and as I said at the beginning, and Ian amplified, the later editions of the book really do respond to the criticisms of the earlier versions. But nonetheless, I think there is a sense in which we do have to constantly think of the extent to which what we understand about issues like power structures in society, what we learn from branches of bioethics that are still less at the forefront than the traditional Anglo-American model, if I can use that rather challengingly. It's work in progress understanding how, beyond that very useful starting point that I think Julian set out really well, we then go on to understand what it actually means in practice and how that might not be universalizable either across the world or even within our own society.
You've also in your report identified as well as the principles of biomedical ethics publication in 1979, you've described a general renewed interest in medical ethics in the course of the 1970s. And I'll come on when we talk about research tomorrow to ask a little bit more about the Declaration of Helsinki and other materials. But you've also identified as a milestone Professor Ian Kennedy's Reith Lectures Unmasking Medicine in 1980. Now, I'm not going to ask you to go over the details of those. They're available to listen to online still. But to what extent did, if you're able to answer this, it may be a historical question, to what extent did that play a role in challenging perhaps perceived wisdom as to the role of etiquette or the role of paternalism?
I'm happy to lead off there if
yes.
Others are, but I'm sure everyone will be keen to jump into that one. Look, I think the question's a really important one. Some would say is that bioethics and medical ethics didn't emerge from within medicine. They didn't emerge from within research. Is that they arose principally as a result of an external critique of the profession and of science and of research. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. The idea that reflective physicians were sitting down and formulating better ways to critique their own work and make themselves more consideration of public interest, that's just not true. I mean, what we saw in the 1960s in particular, to some extent the late 1950s and then into the 1970s, was the emergence of a whole series of social movements that sort of radically critiqued power structures, including in medicine and science and in law. So the civil rights movement in the United States, the feminist movement, particularly in the United States, but around the world, transgender and gay rights, human rights movements emerging out of the Second World War and the human rights critiques in its political sense as well. All of these were critiquing the idea that there was a single way of deciding how we should behave, critiquing the idea that there was a single uniform group that should decide how we should behave or what should be done, and critiquing the idea that power should be invested with powerful groups. So it was because of this that we changed, the idea of respect or, again, Julie and Bobby and Emma were referring to determinations of what should be offered to people and what should be done. That was very much a medical decision. What research should be done, that was very much a medical decision. But because of these social movements, that changed that whole thinking about consent, about medical practice, about what duties and obligations that practitioners have. And it was those things that Ian Kennedy also pointed to, the emergence of legal and public critiques of medicine and medical power and medical decision-making that sort of had, I think, a more lasting impact in the United Kingdom, not so much elsewhere, but right around the globe, there were these social movements that were really the formation of contemporary medical ethics.
Would anyone else wish to contribute on that issue?
Yes, I think it's undeniable that Ian Kennedy's work was incredibly influential, and it sort of brought things into the light that people were doing. But I wouldn't want to completely exclude the medical professionals, because there were things like the London Medical Group, which was that which eventually came to set up the Journal of Medical Ethics, which Julian edited successfully for many years. So there were social movements within medicine. How receptive people were to them in the early days, it is a question of history. But young doctors particularly were also coming to realise that there was a place for internal critique, and there were issues about their own practice that went beyond issues of etiquette, and to use a term that comes up in some of the BMA guidance, brotherhood. So I think there were things that could come together. The social movements, I think, is a nice way of thinking of it, and we mustn't ignore that there was the fledgling social movement within medicine itself.
You're absolutely right, Bobby.
I will want to look at a couple of the pieces of GMC and BMA guidance later when we talk about informed consent and its development and its current status. But just without looking at the documents themselves and picking up on what you set out in your report, is this right? If we're looking at the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s, such guidance as there was to doctors from the General Medical Council was largely, is this fair, concerned with a non-exhaustive list of examples of what not to do, rather than a comprehensive set of ethical guidelines to help doctors to decide what to do. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I think that is a fair comment. There has been guidance for a long time, but its focus has changed over time. I think Professor Kerridge has already described how the focus originally was really on protecting the profession. And part of protecting the profession is making sure that you keep things secret, that you put your patient first. But that's changed over time. The focus has changed away from just protecting the profession and the reputation of the profession, which is still an important thing, to also looking at patients and their values and what it is that they want out of treatment.
Could I add something? I think it's an important perspective on this is that secular bioethics and secular medical ethics only really began probably in the mid-70s and after the advent of artificial ventilation. Until that point, there was no professional applied ethics, bioethics, medical ethics. And these documents were formulated by groups with monopoly powers, and largely they were etiquette. And by etiquette, I mean you eat with your left hand rather than you eat with your fork in your left hand. And they were general proscriptions on certain kinds of things, but there was no developed ethical concepts, principles, frameworks, theories in the way that there was from the mid-70s onwards. And that's why Beecham and Childress's book was so influential. And that saw the beginning in the 80s. Practical ethics and applied ethics really kicked off. And so it's the field is only really 40 years old. And until that point, there was no professional academic medical ethics. It was really done by doctors and professional groups according to their intuitions about how things should be, which were largely based on Judeo-Christian morality.
And we can say the same thing about medical law too. That's a relatively recent development. There were medical law cases, but they were criminal law cases or civil law, tort law cases. But now we have a recognised body of medical law, and most law schools teach medical law.
So
yes, research ethics, interestingly, has a longer history. I mean, partly because of its sort of terrible history, but even prior to the atrocities described at Nuremberg, which formed the basis of sort of modern research ethics, there had been codes of research ethics written in Europe from the early part of the 20th century. So in fact, formalisation of ethics in medicine and the clinical sphere actually came after research ethics, interestingly.
Okay, and we'll certainly pick that up in more detail tomorrow, Professor Kerridge, in relation to research. So I note the time. Would this be a appropriate moment to take a break?
Yes. We normally take about half an hour in the morning to allow those who are watching and you yourselves to have some refreshment if you want, but have a break certainly. So we'll come back, shall we, say 22:12. Would that be all right? That's our time, Professor Kent, and you'll have to translate that into your time. It's 25 minutes from now.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you.